On the morning of the 15th of June 1940, a lone German reconnaissance pilot circled high above the White Cliffs near Dover, studying the coast through a camera that trembled in the turbulence as his aircraft fought to stay steady. When he returned to his base, he filed a report that would confuse and fascinate German intelligence officers for months, because the blurred photographs he carried showed what looked unmistakably like fast-moving armored cars patrolling the Kent coastline in tight, organized formations. From more than 4,000 feet, with RAF fighters hunting nearby, the images were grainy and smudged, but to trained eyes, the silhouettes suggested low-profile armored vehicles built with military purpose. The Germans counted the shapes, the dark boxy outlines, the squared angles that seemed to match known armored car designs, and concluded that Britain had deployed a surprisingly strong, mechanized coastal defense force. They could not have imagined that the vehicles were nothing more than converted Morris commercial lorries flying 14 motor cars and Humber Super Snipe saloons that only 3 months earlier had been delivering groceries or carrying families on country roads. Beneath the hastily painted camouflage patterns, traces of civilian colors still clung to the metal. This was not a display of refined military engineering, nor the result of a carefully planned armored car program. It was national desperation transformed into improvised strategy, and it was British workshop ingenuity working far beyond what anyone expected. Yet the most striking element of this moment was the way German intelligence completely misread what they were seeing. They believed Britain had built a robust mechanized defense, when in truth the country was holding itself together with whatever parts and manpower could be gathered. And from this misjudgment came an insight that would echo throughout the entire year. Sometimes it is more valuable to look dangerous than to actually be dangerous. Sometimes the fear your enemy feels becomes a weapon more powerful than steel plates or heavy guns. Every nation in the war made conversions from civilian vehicles to military ones, and Britain had done so before. The paradox in this case was that these hurriedly built machines, mocked by British officers as armored dustbins and mobile coffins, convinced German analysts that Britain possessed mechanized capabilities multiplied several times beyond reality. Reports compiled from June through August 1940 exaggerated British armored strength by factors of 3 to 5. The Germans described squadrons of armored cars that did not exist, units that in their imagination patrolled the beaches with professional precision, when in truth many of the vehicles were driven by local defense volunteers who had been bakers or shopkeepers months earlier. German documents even referenced armored formations based on sightings of converted bakery vans with 12mm mild steel plates bolted clumsily to their sides. The professional military logic of the era insisted that true armored vehicles had to be designed as such from the ground up. Germany had spent the 1930s perfecting machines like the SDKF, C-222 series with proper hardened armor ballistic shaping, and engines positioned for crew protection. These vehicles had sloped plating capable of resisting standard rifle fire at 100 meters, and suspensions built to handle rough terrain and heavy loads. To the German mind, an armored vehicle was a fully integrated weapons system, not a civilian chassis patched with steel. British military theorists largely agreed, and before the war they too had built armored cars like the Morris CS9, with 7 to 14mm of hardened armor and a rotating turret mounting a boy's anti-tank rifle or a Bren gun. British requirements insisted that armored reconnaissance vehicles should resist rifle fire, at 100 yards maintain top speeds of 45 miles per hour, and move reliably over uneven ground. To these planners, bolting plates onto commercial vehicles seemed almost absurd and even dangerous. It created machines too heavy for their frames, too slow to fulfill reconnaissance duties, and too fragile to survive real combat, where German infantry rifles firing 7.92mm rounds could pierce mild steel plates with ease. Still, none of these theoretical objections mattered when Britain stood in the shadow of invasion. Following the chaos of Dunkirk, the British Expeditionary Force had been forced to abandon nearly all its vehicles, its artillery, and its supply trucks on the French beaches. The Home Guard formed hastily in May numbered more than 1.5 million men by the end of June, yet possessed only a fraction of the rifles they needed and almost no transport. If the Wehrmacht landed, these men would face modern mechanized forces on foot, carrying shotguns, hunting rifles, and improvised weapons. Against that threat, anything that could move and provide a fragment of protection was valuable. The improvised vehicles were never meant to fight German armored cars head-on, nor to exchange fire with invading infantry. Their true purpose was simple but vital. They were mobile observation posts able to move quickly along coast roads. They gave the illusion of organized mechanized patrols that might cause enemy planners to hesitate. And they allowed Home Guard units to respond to multiple landing sites instead of remaining fixed in one place. The conversion program that emerged across Britain reflected this desperate clarity of purpose. Regional workshops and motor engineering firms under loose direction from the Ministry of Supply took whatever vehicles they could find and reinforced them with steel plates, fitted with makeshift mounts for Bren guns, then sent them to patrol routes along the coast. The Standard Motor Company works in Coventry became a surprising hub of this movement, and there the first beaverette named after Lord Beaverbrook was completed on the 7th of July 1940. It used a flying 14-motor car chassis, weighed just under 3 tons, and carried a single Bren gun in a simple rotating mount. In that moment, it did not matter that the Germans thought it was something far more formidable. What mattered was that it existed at all. The objections raised by critics inside the War Office seemed sound when written on paper because the mathematics behind improvised armored vehicles painted a bleak picture. A Morris commercial CS8 lorry from the year 1940 was engineered to carry a modest 1-ton load and weighed a little more than 2 tons without cargo. The moment armor was added, all calculations changed. Even a thin layer of mild steel 10 millimeters thick wrapped around the cabin, an engine added roughly 800 kilograms, which pushed the vehicle past its intended limits, strained the suspension, and dragged the top speed down from an already modest 48 miles per hour to barely 35. Petrol consumption, which had hovered around 14 miles to the gallon, plunged toward 10. And when measured against modern weapons, the protection these plates offered seemed almost meaningless, because mild steel 10 or 12 millimeters thick could stop only low-energy pistol rounds, and perhaps a stray rifle bullet fired from far beyond typical combat ranges. A sharp assessment written in April 1940 mocked these conversions bluntly by stating that one might as well use cardboard for all the good such armor would do when facing determined German troops wielding modern rifles. What the memo overlooked was the core truth of Britain's situation after Dunkirk. The nation was not facing hypothetical battlefield conditions or ideal confrontations designed for textbooks. It was facing imminent invasion with almost no equipment left to resist it. The British Expeditionary Force had abandoned more than 2,400 artillery pieces, around 65,000 vehicles, and 20,000 motorcycles on French soil. The Home Guard, which had sprung into existence on the 14th of May, had grown to nearly 1.5 million by the end of June, yet could count barely 300,000 rifles among them, many dating all the way back to the Great War. If the Wehrmacht attempted to cross the Channel, the defenders would be outgunned, outpaced, and scattered. Britain needed movement above all else, and any movement that could be disguised as armored strength was a gift. The brilliance of the improvised vehicles lay not in their ability to fight, but in their ability to fulfill 3 vital roles. First, they provided mobile eyes, allowing patrols to watch large stretches of coast and report sightings quickly. Second, they created the illusion of a coordinated mechanized defense, which could unsettle German invasion planners and force them to assume that counterattacks might come faster than expected. Third, they gave Home Guard Unit. It's a way to shift rapidly between possible landing zones, which meant that even lightly armed men could reach trouble spots before a foothold solidified. The conversion program that grew from this necessity operated with no unified doctrine because none existed. Instead, it developed through regional workshops, factories, and local garages, all improvising under loose oversight from the Ministry of Supply. Workers accepted the guiding principle: use what you have and build it as fast as you can. At the Standard Motor Company's Coventry Works, the first Beaverette prototype emerged on the 7th of July 1940. Built on a flying 14 chassis, it weighed just under 3 tons once armored and carried a Bren gun mounted in a simple rotating frame. The armor ranged from 10 mm on the front and sides to 7 mm at the rear, with no roof protection at all. Compared to genuine armored car designs, which featured hardened steel sloped angles and purpose-built turrets, the Beaverette looked crude. But compared to a Home Guard patrol on bicycles with rifles strapped to their backs, the vehicle was a revelation. The Beaverette could travel 7 miles of coastal road in 11 minutes. A bicycle patrol required 45. That difference meant one converted car could survey multiple beaches in the time a foot patrol could examine only one. For a nation trying to defend hundreds of miles of vulnerable coastline, such mobility outweighed any technical shortcomings. As German reconnaissance intensified through June and July 1940, Luftwaffe pilots flew high-altitude photography runs and occasional low-level observation missions along the southern coast. They sought evidence of British troop concentrations, artillery positions, and mobile reserves. According to German doctrine, the most dangerous threat to an amphibious landing was not fixed fortifications, but mobile forces able to counterattack before invasion troops established a secure hold. A landing force in its first few hours was vulnerable, and the presence of mechanized patrols in the area created an image of danger. German pilots reported exactly that. Photographs from the 18th of June, taken near Dover, revealed at least 15 vehicles that appeared to be armored cars with squared-off shapes and box-like silhouettes. More sightings followed: 12 vehicles near Folkestone on the 21st, near Hastings on the 25th, 19 near Portsmouth on the 2nd of July. German intelligence analysts compiled these sightings into a formal assessment, concluding that Britain possessed at least 400 armored cars arrayed along probable landing zones. One report filed on the 5th of July by Oberleutnant Hans Kirchner described what he believed to be organized company-strength patrols along Romney Marsh. He flew at 2,000 feet, low enough to track movement patterns. From that vantage, he observed several vehicles traveling in formation, stopping at intervals, scanning the coastline, and coordinating their movements like trained reconnaissance units. He wrote that Britain had positioned dedicated armored reconnaissance forces capable of rapid response to any attempted landing, describing them as a significant threat to German assault troops. The report was reasonable based on what he saw. Yet Kirchner could not know that he was watching 5 Beaverettes, 3 Humber saloons, crudely armored by bolting steel sheets to their frames, and 2 improvised armored trucks assembled by a local garage in Ashford. None of these vehicles would have survived a true firefight. But from above in motion, framed by the logic of German military doctrine, they looked precisely like professional armored patrols ready to respond quickly. By August 1940, German intelligence estimated that Britain possessed between 800 and 1,200 armored cars dedicated to home defense. The truth was far smaller and far more complicated. Britain had only around 180 armored or semi-armored vehicles available in June and July, when German planning for Operation Sea Lion was most active, and only about 60 of those could generously be described as true armored cars. The rest were converted lorries, improvised trucks, or even wooden mock-ups meant to confuse reconnaissance. British commanders had not deployed these vehicles to deceive. They kept them moving out of necessity because there were too few to sit idle. Yet this constant movement created an illusion. A single beaverette might be photographed near Dover in the morning, near Deal at midday, and near Dover again in the afternoon. German analysts, assuming fixed deployments, interpreted each sighting as a different vehicle. British officers on the ground recognized this accidental advantage. One local commander in Kent recorded in his diary that he had 6 armored vans running constant patrols and hoped the Germans believed he had dozens. His wish was granted. The truth hidden beneath the improvised armor was that these vehicles were not meant to fight, but to watch, to report, and to force the Wehrmacht to question what they believed they knew. The truth behind Britain's improvised armored force became clearer when one examined the vehicles up close, because the beaverettes that German pilots repeatedly mistook for purpose-built armored cars were in reality little more than patched-together shells of mild steel fitted onto ordinary motor car frames. The armor on the standard beaverette measured 10 millimeters on the front and sides, and 7 millimeters at the rear, leaving the roof entirely open. No military engineer would have considered such a machine suitable for true reconnaissance work on a battlefield where rifle-fire machine gun bursts and artillery fragments were constant threats. Yet within Britain's desperate circumstances, these vehicles filled a role that could not be measured by traditional specifications. Their strength lay not in firepower, but in what they enabled the Home Guard to do. A beaverette with its meager armor and single Bren gun mount could reach a position 7 miles away in 11 minutes, which allowed patrols to move up and down coastal roads before dawn during daylight and deep into night hours. Before their arrival, such routes had been manned by men on bicycles who could cover only short distances before fatigue set in. The Home Guard relied on these vehicles not because they were effective armored cars, but because they provided something no foot or bicycle patrol could offer: mobility, speed, and the illusion of strength. As German reconnaissance activity increased throughout June and July 1940, the Luftwaffe focused on capturing photographs that would reveal weaknesses in British coastal defenses. German pilots flew high-altitude missions to identify troop positions, artillery sites, and fortified emplacements, but they also conducted lower passes to observe mobile forces. Their doctrine emphasized the danger posed by reserves capable of rapid counterattack. If Britain possessed mobile units along the coast capable of striking soon after a landing, they could disrupt the formation of a beachhead and prevent German forces from securing ground. The photographs these pilots returned with seemed to confirm that such reserves existed because the vehicles they observed appeared to be moving in coordinated patterns with spacing that matched trained reconnaissance procedures. On the 18th of June, near Dover, more than 15 such vehicles were sighted progressing along the roads that overlooked the beaches. Each dark rectangle on film seemed to match the shape of an armored hull with squared edges and sharp silhouettes. On the 21st of June, 12 more were seen near Folkestone. On the 25th, 8 were spotted near Hastings. On the 2nd of July, 19 were observed near Portsmouth. What the Germans could not grasp was that many of these sightings were of the same vehicles photographed at different times of day or in different locations. The shortage of actual armored cars forced Britain to disperse them widely and to keep them moving. A beaverette patrolling from Dover to Deal could easily appear on multiple reconnaissance films and be counted as several separate machines. And so German analysts began to inflate their estimates. They wrote assessments suggesting that Britain fielded hundreds of armored cars organized into squadrons and positioned along the coast in anticipation of invasion. These conclusions were drawn logically based on what reconnaissance pilots believed they had observed. For instance, Oberleutnant Hans Kirchner, who flew a low-altitude pass along the Kent coast on the 5th of July, produced a report describing coordinated patrols conducted by what he called a company-strength armored reconnaissance formation. He stated that the vehicles demonstrated solid road speed and appeared to operate under unified command. He warned that these armored units constituted a serious threat to any German landing force because they could respond quickly to attempts to secure a foothold. In reality, Kirchner had watched 5 beaverettes, 3 converted Humber saloons, and 2 crude armored trucks built by a garage in Ashford using whatever steel was at hand. Not one of those vehicles could have withstood direct rifle fire at close range, let alone engage trained German infantry. But from 2,000 feet, they looked precisely like the machines German doctrine warned against. The misinterpretation grew through July and into August. Intelligence reports claimed that Britain had between 800 and 1,200 armored cars in its home defense structure. The actual number during this critical planning period for Operation Sea Lion was closer to 180, and of those roughly 60 could be described as armored at all. Many of the remaining vehicles were improvised creations with partial plating, and some were nothing more than wooden shapes designed to mislead reconnaissance photographs. What gave these illusions power was not British strategic deception, but British necessity. The Home Guard had too few vehicles to leave them idle, and so they patrolled constantly. A single patrol car might be seen at 9 in the morning near Dover, then again at 10:30 near Deal, and later that afternoon near Dover once more. German analysts did not consider the possibility that one vehicle traveled such distances because their own armored formations did not operate that way. They assumed fixed positions and structured deployments, which led them to miscount the same machines again and again. British commanders recognized this pattern even without realizing the intelligence impact. One Home Guard officer in Kent wrote in his diary that he had 6 of the new armored vans, which his men jokingly called beaver tins. He said he kept them driving in rotating 8-hour shifts and hoped that the German pilots who flew overhead believed he had dozens rather than half a dozen. His guess proved accurate. German estimates for that sector suggested at least 18 to 24. Armored cars were operating there, when in truth, only 6 vehicles roamed those roads driven by volunteers, who had never operated military machines, and who used ordinary road maps for navigation. Yet, these improvised armored vans offered genuine advantages beyond deception. Their protection, though limited, allowed crews to approach closer to suspicious activity without immediate danger. They could observe landing attempts or troop movements from distances that foot patrols could never reach safely. In a wartime environment where the RAF and regular army were stretched thin, these vehicles extended Britain's eyes along the coast. German planning documents reveal how deeply this illusion took hold. Operation Sea Lion assessments prepared in July and August repeatedly warned invasion commanders about mobile British armored forces capable of rapid counterattack. The Germans evaluated these supposed forces as strong enough to require avoidance rather than direct engagement. Ironically, had German troops actually confronted one of these improvised vehicles, they would have destroyed it easily. But they never reached that point because the perception of danger shaped their decisions. The image of strength was enough to influence enemy planning. And it was that image, not the steel itself, that helped delay an invasion Britain could barely afford to fight. The widening gap between German perception and British reality became even more striking as the summer of 1940 progressed, because although German analysts were convinced Britain possessed an extensive armored reconnaissance network, the truth on the ground remained far more fragile. By August, German intelligence summaries suggested that between 800 and 1,200 armored cars were positioned for home defense. Yet the real number available during June and July, the critical months when Operation Sea Lion planning was at its most active, was closer to 180. Of those, perhaps 60 could fairly be described as armored vehicles, while the rest were converted. Lorries improvised trucks with partial plating, and in a few cases, simple wooden frames shaped to resemble armored hulls when viewed from above. The reason German estimates soared so dramatically lay not in any deliberate British deception, but in the way the vehicles were deployed. British commanders working with almost no formal doctrine for such improvised machines scattered the limited number of vehicles over long stretches of coastline, and kept them constantly on the move. This was essential because each region had too few vehicles to maintain static posts. Instead, a single beaverette, or converted humber, might cover 20 or 30 miles of coastal road within a day, patrolling one area in the morning, another by noon, and returning by evening. German reconnaissance flights photographed the same vehicles repeatedly from different angles and at different times. Since German armored formations typically operated in fixed positions and rotated through structured patrol schedules, German analysts interpreted each sighting as a separate vehicle. What appeared on film as several distinct armored cars might in fact be the same machine captured multiple times. This misunderstanding grew even more potent when pilots observed how these vehicles moved. British crews tried to maintain patterns that felt organized because they believed discipline made them more effective. They halted at predetermined intervals, scanned the coastline in teams, and coordinated their movements by simple hand signals or shouted directions. From 2,000 feet, these gestures and brief stops looked like trained reconnaissance procedures carried out by professionally equipped patrol units. A diary entry from Lieutenant Colonel William Mills, who commanded a Home Guard sector in Kent, described how accidental this illusion truly was. Writing on the 3rd of July 1940, he noted that he had 6 armored vans which his men had begun calling Beaver Tins. He admitted they were hardly impressive machines, but he kept them circulating in 8-hour shifts because German aircraft flew overhead constantly. His hope, he wrote, was that if the enemy saw them often enough, they might assume Britain possessed far more than 6. His observation proved prophetic because German intelligence officers later estimated that his sector alone held enough armored cars to form 2 platoons totaling between 18 and 24 vehicles. Yet those patrols consisted only of 6 improvised machines driven by volunteers, many of whom had never handled anything more complex than a delivery truck before the war. The strength of these converted vans lay not in firepower or armor, but in the uncertainty they created. Their purpose was never to fight German forces directly. Against disciplined infantry armed with rifles firing 7.92mm rounds, these vehicles would have fared poorly. Instead, their role was to observe, report, and maintain contact with enemy movements. German planners recognized how dangerous this kind of mobility could be. A landing force is most vulnerable in its first hours, while equipment is still being unloaded, and defensive perimeters have yet to be established. Mobile units capable of monitoring several landing sites and relaying information quickly could disrupt the timing and organization of an invasion. Even weakly armored patrols could impose delays by forcing the attackers to proceed more cautiously. A clear example of this came during Operation Lobster, a British defensive exercise held from the 14th to the 15th of August 1940. Regular army troops simulated the role of German invaders landing at Cuckmere Haven in Sussex, while the Home Guard was responsible for detection and early response. At 3:47 in the morning, a beaverette patrol manned by Corporal James Hewitt, who had been a garage mechanic in civilian life, noticed unusual activity on the beach while traveling along his assigned route. Because of the vehicle's modest armor, he was able to move closer than a bicycle or foot patrol could safely approach, closing to within 400 yards, which gave him the clarity needed to identify the soldiers as part of the exercise invasion force rather than smugglers or civilians. After confirming what he saw, he withdrew rapidly, reaching a command post equipped with a telephone within 11 minutes. Had he been on foot or riding a bicycle, the journey would have taken far longer and the detection would have come too late. The exercise directors noted that this early warning provided regular forces an additional 37 minutes to reach blocking positions. In a real invasion, that extra time might have determined whether the Germans were stalled near the waterline or allowed to move inland. As the exercise continued, the 3 beaverettes assigned to monitor likely inland advance routes maintained visual contact with the simulated enemy. They relayed information about direction strength, and speed allowing regular units to position themselves precisely. Though the Beaverettes never fired a shot, their contribution shaped the entire defensive response. In the post-exercise analysis, the officer commanding the simulated German force remarked that he initially believed he would encounter little resistance. But when his troops realized armored vehicles were watching their movements, he became cautious. Not knowing what additional forces might be present, he slowed his advance by more than 1/3. This psychological hesitation mirrored what German planners feared when preparing estimates for Operation Sea Lion. They knew their troops could defeat static defenses and disorganized local volunteers, but the presence of mobile reconnaissance vehicles added a layer of unpredictability. A planning document warned invasion commanders to avoid engaging these armored cars whenever possible, because doing so might divert troops from essential objectives. Ironically, if German units had chosen to attack, they would have destroyed the improvised vehicles quickly. But the appearance of capability proved more influential than the reality. Beneath the thin metal plates, the converted vans hid a deeper truth about war in 1940. Military effectiveness was not defined by absolute strength, but by what the enemy believed you could do. And along the British coast, belief had become its own form of armor. The true measure of Britain's improvised armored vehicles emerged clearly during Operation Lobster, the large-scale defensive exercise conducted between the 14th and 15th of August 1940. In this simulated invasion, regular army units played the role of German landing forces coming ashore at Cuckmere Haven in Sussex, while Home Guard detachments were responsible for early detection and rapid reporting. The exercise was intended to test communication, readiness mobility under pressure, and the ability of scattered defensive units to respond coherently before a foothold could be established. What unfolded during those hours revealed why the improvised vans, though clumsy, noisy, and badly armored, were far more valuable than they appeared. At 3:47 in the dim early morning, a Beaverette patrol crewed by Corporal James Hewitt approached the coastline along a narrow road that wound between hedgerows. Hewitt, a garage mechanic before joining the Home Guard, had been assigned to this route because he knew the area well and could navigate confidently even in low light. From a distance, he noticed shadows moving in ways that did not belong to fishermen, smugglers, or local villagers. Wanting to confirm what he saw, he guided the Beaverette closer, using its limited armor to shield himself and the other volunteer inside. He maneuvered to within 400 yards and observed silhouettes unloading supplies from boats and spreading out along the beach. In darkness, a bicycle or foot patrol would have struggled to get that close safely, and even if they had, they would have taken far longer to carry the news to a command post. Hewitt withdrew at once, turning the Beaverette around and driving at top speed until he reached a farmhouse that had been converted into a temporary command center. He arrived 11 minutes after first spotting the activity and relayed the report through the field telephone. The exercise directing staff later noted that this early warning provided the regular army with a 37-minute advantage, allowing blocking units to reach their positions before the simulated invaders advanced inland. For the Home Guard and the Beaverette crews, this moment demonstrated exactly why their improvised machines mattered. They could approach danger faster, remain near danger longer, and carry information away from danger swiftly. That single difference shifted the timing of the entire exercise. As the scenario progressed, the simulated German force moved inland along predetermined routes. The Home Guard had positioned 3 Beaverettes at different intervals along the expected advance path, each hidden behind hedgerows or low rises. These vehicles maintained visual contact with the enemy without engaging them. They relayed location strength and movement reports at frequent intervals, enabling the regular units preparing the counterattack to know precisely when and where to strike. The Beaverettes were not designed to fight and did not attempt to. Their thin steel plates would not have stopped rifle fire at close range. Their engines were loud and their mobility was limited off-road, but they could observe and endure light shrapnel and pistol fire. They could remain in place long enough to track enemy patterns. They could report quickly. That was their purpose, and Operation Lobster showed that purpose clearly. When the regular forces finally engaged the advancing exercise troops, the element of surprise was complete because the defenders knew the exact moment of contact. The after-action report, written by the officer commanding the simulated German force, included a telling observation. He wrote that his initial expectation was to push inland rapidly, because he believed resistance would consist of poorly equipped Home Guard detachments with rifles and improvised explosives. But when his forward elements realized they were being watched by armored vehicles that appeared to be coordinating observation, he ordered a slower, more cautious advance, reducing his rate of movement by nearly a third. The report concluded that the presence of mobile armored surveillance elements introduced uncertainty because the invaders could not easily determine the scale of opposing forces. This hesitation mirrored what German planners feared in their real invasion preparations. Intelligence summaries prepared for operation. Sealion warned that British coastal defenses included mechanized reconnaissance elements that should not be engaged directly. Troops were instructed that if armored vehicles were sighted, they should bypass them rather than attempt to destroy them, because engaging such units might delay the primary objectives of securing roads, bridges, and inland routes. This caution was ironic. Had German forces engaged the improvised Home Guard vehicles, they would have destroyed them quickly, but perception shaped planning and planning shaped behavior. The Germans believed Britain possessed a significant fleet of armored cars ready to counterattack, so they prepared to avoid them. In that sense, the improvised vehicles achieved exactly what they needed to achieve. Their technical specifications painted a far humbler picture. The Beaverette Mark I used 10mm mild steel plates on the front and sides, and 7mm plates at the rear. The steel was not ballistic quality nor heat-treated for hardness. Against a 7.92mm mortar round the armor could be penetrated at any distance closer than 250 yards. Against a 303 British rifle round, a similar penetration occurred at roughly 200 yards. Laboratory tests showed these vehicles were only marginally protected. Yet on battlefields, the threat did not come only from direct rifle fire. Before Dunkirk, casualty analyses from British armoured units revealed that around 65% of injuries resulted from indirect fire artillery, shrapnel, grenade fragments, or glancing hits, rather than precision anti-tank weapons. For crews on observation, duty protection against fragments mattered far more than stopping dedicated rifle rounds. Sergeant Robert Mackenzie, who trained Home Guard units on Beaverette operations, explained this reality bluntly to new drivers in August 1940. Standing beside a freshly converted vehicle, he told them the armor would not save them from a determined enemy with a rifle at close range, but it would protect them from pistol fire, from long-range rifle shots, from flying fragments, and from being instantly visible targets. He taught them that survival depended not on the metal, but on how they used the vehicle, keeping distance, maintaining movement, and relying on their speed and concealment. Suspension modifications also reflected the practical ingenuity behind these machines. Standard motor cars in 1940 used leaf spring suspension systems designed for small passenger loads. Adding 800 kilograms of armor should have crushed the springs completely, but engineers simply added more leaves, stiffening the suspension by about 40%. Drivers later reported that the ride felt harsh, like pushing a wheelbarrow over stones, yet maintenance records showed the modified suspension held up well enough with one failure per 800 operational hours. Everything about these improvised armored vehicles spoke to the same reality. Britain did not have the luxury of time or proper materials. The nation needed functional tools immediately, and so it built machines that could observe, deceive, and delay. In Operation Lobster, they proved they could do all three. The illusion of strength, combined with the practical ability to see and report, made them far more important than their crude construction suggested. The weaknesses of Britain's improvised armored vehicles were obvious to anyone who examined them closely, yet the ingenuity behind their construction revealed why they succeeded despite limitations. The Beaverette's armor consisted of 10mm mild steel plates on the front and sides, and 7mm sheets at the rear, all bolted onto a frame built around a standard motor car chassis. This was not hardened ballistic steel. It was ordinary construction plate similar to what might be used in shipbuilding or industrial frameworks. When tested against a 7.92 mm Morser round fired from a German Kar 9.8 rifle, the armor was penetrated at any distance shorter than 250 yards. When struck by a 303 British round from a Lee Enfield, it was penetrated at around 200 yards. The numbers proved clearly that these vehicles were not suited for direct combat. Yet battlefield reality does not always mirror laboratory results. British studies of casualties among armoured crews in France prior to Dunkirk showed that roughly 65% of injuries came from artillery fragments, grenade shrapnel or indirect fire, rather than direct hits from anti-tank weapons. Fragmentation from explosions loses force rapidly over distance, and even 10mm of mild steel can stop or deflect splinters that would otherwise be lethal. For vehicles whose primary purpose was observation rather than combat, this degree of protection mattered enormously. Sergeant Robert Mackenzie, a veteran assigned to train Home Guard, Beaverette crews in August 1940, understood this better than most. He addressed new volunteers with plain honesty, telling them their armor would not save them from a determined German rifleman at close range, but it would protect them from pistol rounds, long-distance rifle fire, and flying debris. Most importantly, he impressed upon them that the plates helped conceal movement by preventing the human outline from being easily distinguished at a distance. He reminded them that in real combat the enemy cannot shoot what he cannot clearly see, and that concealment combined with mobility gave them their best odds of survival. A deeper look at the engineering behind these improvised machines reveals a similar pattern of practical adaptation. Standard motor cars in 1940 were built with leaf spring suspension systems intended to support 300 or 400 kilograms of passengers and luggage. Adding 800 kilograms of steel should have crushed these springs, entirely leaving the vehicle incapable of movement. Engineers at the Standard factory in Coventry faced this problem with no access to specialized suspension components or advanced tooling. Their solution was remarkably simple. They reinforced each spring by adding additional steel leaves and increasing stiffness by roughly 40%. The result was a harsh ride that drivers later compared to being rattled in a tin box pushed down a cobblestone road. Yet despite the discomfort, the modified suspension held up under service conditions. Maintenance logs from Home Guard units recorded approximately 1 suspension failure for every 800 hours of operation. For an improvised vehicle driven primarily on paved or lightly worn roads during short patrols, this was acceptable. The manufacturing process behind the Beaverettes and other improvised armored vehicles highlights the strategic brilliance of Britain's approach. Proper armored car production required precision workshops, heat treatment furnaces, drop forges for shaping curved armor plates, and heavy machinery for turret construction. These tools existed in Britain, but were entirely consumed by the urgent production of tanks, aircraft, and artillery needed on the front lines. Diverting even a fraction of this industrial capacity to home defense vehicles was impossible. Yet British factories that normally produced civilian cars still possessed valuable resources. They had metalworking tools, welding equipment, drills, presses, stamping machines, and skilled laborers familiar with assembly processes. These facilities could not produce hardened armor, but they could cut mild steel plates, bolt them to chassis-reinforced suspensions, and build simple gun mounts. In other words, they could create crude but functional armored shells quickly. The first Beaverette took only 17 days from initial sketches to operational prototype. A purpose-built armored car in the same period would have required months. This rapid improvisation became a nationwide effort. In Birmingham, a company that previously manufactured industrial boilers found itself converting Humber saloons into lightly armored vehicles. The workers who had spent years shaping steel for boilers adapted their skills to car bodies, though with little concern for aesthetics. They built box-like steel shells and mounted them to existing frames with bolted joints that allowed some flexibility. The results were not elegant, but they met the essential requirement that the vehicle hold together while moving at moderate speeds. Production soon reached 15 conversions per week using labor and equipment that would have otherwise sat idle. In Yorkshire, a rural garage joined the effort using agricultural steel plates normally meant for reinforcing barn floors. The quality of the steel was uncertain, and the thickness often only 8 millimeters, but the material was abundant. Workers cut the plates with industrial torches, drilled bolt holes by hand, and fastened them onto delivery lorries requisitioned from local businesses. Home Guard units receiving these vehicles were instructed to maintain greater distance from suspected enemy positions and rely on speed rather than armor. The effectiveness of these improvised vehicles becomes clearer when examining how the Germans interpreted them. Planning documents for Operation Sea Lion reveal that German staff consistently overestimated British mobile reserves. Reports dated July and August 1940 warned that Britain intended to counter any landing with coordinated armoured reconnaissance forces. Germany's invasion planners believed the British relied on mobile defence rather than fixed positions, and that significant armoured car units patrolled along the coast. To counter this perceived threat, German staff recommended that additional anti-tank guns be landed during the initial assault phase. This requirement created logistical strain. Anti-tank guns were heavy and cumbersome to offload, especially across beaches. Every gun placed in the first wave took the place of infantry supplies or engineering equipment. Each new requirement stretched the invasion plan further. Squadron leader Robert Wright of RAF Intelligence later recalled that Britain intercepted and decoded some German reconnaissance reports and realized the Germans were vastly overestimating armored strength. He suspected that this misapprehension played a role in slowing German planning. The more resources Germany believed were necessary to counter British defenses, the longer their preparations would take, and the more vulnerable their invasion forces would become to RAF attacks on ports and staging areas. He described the mathematics of amphibious invasion as unforgiving. Germany needed to land enormous numbers of troops in the first wave, supported by artillery transport barges and supply lines. Each additional constraint, such as preparing to face armored counterattacks, made the operation more fragile. In this light, the improvised armored cars achieved something extraordinary. They did not defeat German forces on the battlefield. They did not fire upon or destroy enemy positions. Instead, they shaped the enemy's thinking. They forced planners to assume greater resistance. They introduced uncertainty into assessments that should have been straightforward. They complicated an already perilous plan. And in a summer when Britain stood alone with scarce resources and weary troops, that complication mattered as much as any weapon forged in a proper factory. The improvised vans built from desperation had become strategic instruments not through strength or durability, but through perception and impact on enemy calculation. In the story of 1940, this subtle influence became another unseen barrier to invasion. The speed at which Britain produced these improvised armored vehicles revealed the full extent of its industrial resilience during the dark summer of 1940. Because the first Beaverette prototype moved from concept to finished machine in just 17 days. Under normal circumstances, a purpose-built armored car required months of design adjustment, armored plate, shaping, mechanical testing, and weapons integration. But Britain had no time for traditional processes. The factories that had once built family motor cars pivoted overnight into improvised defense workshops, working under the guiding principle of producing something usable as quickly as possible. The Standard Motor Company in Coventry captured this spirit completely. Its workers possessed no equipment for forging hardened armor plate, no specialized machinery for turret mounts, and no ballistic testing capabilities. Yet they had drills, welders, cutting tools, and an intimate understanding of how to assemble motor cars. By bolting flat steel plates onto existing chassis, reinforcing suspension, springs, and designing simple open-top gun mounts, they produced vehicles that satisfied the urgent requirements of mobility, observation, and protection from fragmentation. Across Britain, similar efforts emerged. In Birmingham, a factory that once manufactured industrial boilers transformed its operations to strengthen Humber saloons with steel shells formed from boiler plate. The workers, accustomed to shaping metal cylinders, simply applied the same methods to building crude armored bodies. They anchored these shells to existing automotive frames with bolted joints designed to allow slight flexibility so that the chassis would not crack under stress. The vehicles performed unevenly and looked ungainly, yet production increased steadily until they were delivering 15 conversions each week by mid-July 1940. Their success came not from military precision, but from the simple fact that they transformed idle workshops into assets. In Yorkshire, a rural garage used agricultural steel plates typically intended for barn construction. These plates were often just 8 mm thick and varied in quality, yet they were available in large quantities and cost almost nothing. Mechanics cut them to shape with acetylene torches, drilled mounting holes, and bolted them onto delivery lorries taken from local businesses. These makeshift armored trucks were then distributed to home guard units with straightforward instructions: maintain distance, avoid direct confrontation, and rely on mobility rather than protection. Despite their crude origins, these improvised vehicles proved effective in shaping intelligence. German planning documents for operation, Sea Lion, reveal how deeply the illusion of British armored strength had influenced enemy thinking. Reports compiled in late July and early August stated that British defensive doctrine appeared to depend on mobile counterattack rather than fixed fortifications. The documents warned that armored reconnaissance forces were likely stationed along the coast capable of reacting rapidly to a landing attempt. Such assessments came from the repeated sightings of improvised vehicles moving along roads in what appeared to be coordinated patrols. The Germans, reasoning from their own doctrine, believed that any nation deploying armored cars for coast defense must possess deeper mechanized reserves inland. This assumption created a cascading effect. German invasion planners recommended that additional anti-tank guns be included in the first assault waves to counter the expected armored response. These weapons were heavy, awkward to maneuver, and difficult to land across open beaches. Every gun that entered the first wave reduced the available room for infantry, supplies, communications teams, and engineering units essential for securing a foothold. Each added requirement strained Germany's invasion capacity and extended the time needed to gather barges, motorboats, and tugs for transport. At ports along the French and Belgian coast, thousands of vessels had to be assembled in plain view of RAF aviation, which launched repeated attacks. Squadron leader Robert Wright of RAF intelligence later reflected that Britain had intercepted numerous German reconnaissance reports during this period. Analysts realized the Germans were dramatically overestimating British armored capability, yet they could not be certain whether that misreading discouraged the invasion. Wright believed that although the Germans did not fear armored divisions hidden inland, the uncertainty surrounding Britain's mobile reserves increased caution within their planning. Each new consideration, however small, multiplied risks and delayed timelines. The mathematics of amphibious invasion allowed little margin for error. German forces needed to land nearly 90,000 troops, artillery units, and supplies in the opening stages across a coastal stretch of roughly 40 miles between Folkestone and Brighton. This required nearly 2,000 barges and more than 1,000 motorboats. Concentrating such assets created vulnerability. Every day, those barges gathered in harbours, their presence invited British air attacks. In such conditions, any factor that expanded logistical complexity made Operation Sea Lion harder to execute. Whether the improvised armored vehicles tipped the balance in counseling the invasion remains impossible to prove. But their effect was unmistakable. They intensified German uncertainty. They forced planners to anticipate contingencies that did not exist. They increased the proportion of anti-tank weapons required for the initial assault. They lengthened preparation times. They deepened the sense that British defences were more resilient than they actually were. And all of this came from vehicles that were never intended as instruments of deception. Britain simply lacked the industrial bandwidth to produce proper armoured cars for home defence, and therefore used what it had. The deception emerged organically from necessity. German reconnaissance pilots observing vehicles from 2,000 or 4,000 feet could not distinguish 10mm mild steel from 30mm hardened plate. They could not differentiate a converted delivery van from a purpose-built armoured car. They saw motion patterns that matched their expectations of trained reconnaissance units. The vehicles operated in pairs or small groups paused at regular intervals and shifted positions frequently because their operators tried to follow sensible patrol routines. German analysts interpreted these movements through the lens of their own doctrine, concluding that Britain possessed far more armoured assets than existed. This misinterpretation revealed a deeper truth about warfare. Military power does not exist solely in absolute measurements of armour thickness, muzzle velocity, or troop numbers. It also exists in the perceptions formed by adversaries. A capability believed to be strong can influence enemy behaviour as effectively as a capability that is strong. Britain's improvised armoured vehicles embodied this principle perfectly. They possessed little real combat potential, yet they altered German decision-making. Private Frederick Holmes, a Home Guard volunteer who patrolled the Sussex coast in a converted Humber throughout the summer of 1940, understood this intuitively. Reflecting years later, he recalled that every man in those vehicles knew they would not survive a proper fight. But they also knew that their job was not to win battles. Their job was to be seen to be counted to be mistaken for something stronger. He compared them to scarecrows guarding fields. The scarecrow does not need to fight the crows. It simply needs to stand in the right place and look convincing. And in that desperate summer when Britain faced the threat of invasion, looking convincing was enough. The closer one studies the German planning for Operation Sea Lion, the clearer it becomes that Britain's improvised armoured vehicles, though crude and flimsy, exerted an influence far greater than their physical capabilities. German invasion doctrine required landing approximately 90,000 troops in the first wave, supported by artillery engineers, and supplies across a coastal stretch nearly 40 miles wide between Folkestone and Brighton. To achieve this, they needed close to 2,000 barges, more than 1,200 motorboats, and a host of larger support vessels. All of these had to gather in ports that lay directly under the reach of RAF bombers. Every additional requirement added to the invasion plan. More weapons, more defensive considerations, more landing priorities expanded the time and the logistical burden of assembling that enormous fleet. And every hour, those vessels sat clustered in French and Belgian harbours increased the likelihood of destruction from air attack. When German planners misread Britain's improvised armoured patrols as evidence of significant mechanized reserves, it intensified the sense of risk inherent in an operation that already strained Germany's capacity. They believed the British could counterattack swiftly with armoured cars and mobile units. They believed landing forces would face coordinated reconnaissance resistance. They believed the defenders possessed the ability to concentrate armoured patrols at vulnerable beachheads. Each of these assumptions was false, but each forced Germany to plan more cautiously. That caution translated into slower preparations, heavier logistical demands, and expanded vulnerability. The improvised British vehicles did not stop an invasion through combat, but through doubt. The misunderstanding stemmed from the gap between what German pilots observed and what those observations truly represented. From the altitude of reconnaissance flights, a converted delivery lorry with 10mm steel plates looked remarkably similar to a proper armored car. A Humber saloon refitted with a rudimentary steel shell resembled a low-profile reconnaissance machine. A beaverette patrolling repeatedly across a wide stretch of coast appeared in photographs as several different vehicles. The constant movement of these improvised patrols created an illusion of abundance because German analysts assumed each sighting was distinct. Their doctrine taught them that armored units operated in structured formations rather than long-shifting roving patrols. They saw patterns where none existed. They interpreted necessity as strategy, and they believed the home guard vehicles were components of a much larger mechanized system. Yet the reality on the British side was almost heartbreakingly simple. Britain did not have enough vehicles to defend every likely landing point, and so it kept the few it had in constant motion. That constant motion stretched German assumptions far beyond the truth. In the months after the war, RAF intelligence officers reviewed intercepted German reports from 1940 and saw clearly how reconnaissance pilots had interpreted these improvised machines as mobile armored companies capable of immediate counterattack. Squadron leader Robert Wright wrote that although Britain did not realize at the time how deeply the illusion had taken root, it nonetheless played into Germany's hesitation. He believed that uncertainty rather than fear of overwhelming force helped deter the invasion. It was not that the Germans imagined Britain had hidden armored divisions waiting inland. Rather, it was the sense that landing forces would face unpredictable mobile resistance that complicated their planning. The more variables Germany identified, the more risks they perceived, and amphibious invasions cannot survive excess risk. The improvised vehicles also taught an important lesson about the nature of military effectiveness. Strength in warfare is not measured solely by the thickness of armor or the lethality of weapons, but by the influence one force exerts on another's decision-making. A capability that appears stronger than it is can alter enemy choices just as effectively as a capability that truly is strong. Britain's converted vans and makeshift armored cars embodied this principle perfectly. They did not outperform German reconnaissance vehicles. They did not match the firepower of real armored units. They could not withstand significant rifle fire or even prolonged pursuit. Yet they shaped the conduct of enemy planning. They complicated the assumptions underlying Operation Sea Lion. They forced the Germans to divert anti-tank guns into the first assault waves to counter a threat that did not exist. They delayed the timetable for invasion as each added requirement generated more logistical strain. Whether these vehicles alone convinced Hitler to postpone and ultimately abandon the invasion remains unanswerable. But they undeniably made Operation Sea Lion more difficult to execute. They imposed friction on an already fragile plan. They clouded the clarity that German commanders needed to proceed boldly. And in a moment when Britain lacked tanks, artillery, and experienced forces for home defense, even small contributions carried immense weight. The subtler effect of these vehicles emerged in the recollections of the men who drove them. Private Frederick Holmes, who spent nights patrolling the Sussex coast in a converted Humber saloon, later explained that every man inside those machines understood their limitations. They knew the steel could not stop a determined rifle volley. They knew a direct confrontation with German troops would end quickly, yet they also understood their real purpose. They were never meant to win battles. They were meant to be seen, to be counted, to be mistaken for something more dangerous. Holmes described them as scarecrows of steel. A scarecrow does not fight the crows. It simply looks enough like a threat to keep the birds away. In 1940, that image of threat served Britain well. It bought time, strengthened confidence, complicated enemy action, and provided a thin but vital layer of psychological defense. The improvised armored vehicles built from desperation and ordinary materials did not win the war. But in the summer when invasion loomed, they performed the one task Britain needed most. They made the Germans think twice. They introduced doubt, and doubt standing between Britain and the Wehrmacht became as valuable as any tank division. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, Subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.